and welcome to Cuppa with a Doula. I'm your host, Alicia. I'm an exercise physiologist. I am a doula. I am a mum to two girls, and I am doing this podcast to help mums and parents out there to feel like they're not alone, to spread awareness of things that happen when birthing. I create a platform for women to safely share their birthing and their parenting story, regardless of where they birth, whether it's a hospital birth, whether it's a planned C-section, whether it's birthing in a birth center or birthing at home with or without a midwife. It's all on Cuppa with a Doula. And every month I interview a professional in the field of pregnancy and birth. So far, I've had a student midwife, a birth photographer, a clinical nutritionist, a women's health physiotherapist, and Catherine Bell from the Birth Map. And now this week we have Sally Cusack from Maternity Choices Australia. And all these experts come and share their knowledge on the podcast in the aim of raising awareness to important things related to pregnancy, birth, and parenting. So thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. And if you've been enjoying the podcast, please consider leaving a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, because it really helps me to reach more people and to help more parents and more mums out there. So please consider leaving a review or even sharing it. Spread the word out there. Cuppa with a Doula. If you want to come on the podcast, there is a form in the show notes that you can use to get in touch with me, and then I will get back to you and we can record an episode together. Let's dive right in. Today's episode is a bit of a different one because it is an episode I really wanted to do to talk about the 3 pillars of physiological birth. So if you are planning to have a physiological, undisturbed, maybe even drug-free birth, or you are thinking about having a physiological birth for when you get pregnant, this episode is definitely for you. So what I am chatting about is the 3 pillars of physiological birth, according to Dr. Sarah Buckley. The reason why I wanted to do this episode was because of the rates of intervention that are happening in the hospital system in Australia. So to start with, I have actually taken data from the Mothers and Babies report, the latest one, and I have actually put that into perspective. So everything you will hear in this episode is my own perspective. It's my own opinion. I have taken data, so that's obviously set in stone. I didn't make those up. I am comparing data from different years, so hopefully you find that interesting. But also I just wanted to put a disclaimer out there that some of the things I'm saying, I'm making a generalization, and I know that not all hospitals are like that, and obviously I can't give a specific example of which hospital is better than another because I don't know, so I am generalizing here. I will leave you to this episode. I think this intro has been long enough, and I really hope you enjoy it and you take something from it. If you do, please feel free to share this episode. It is a topic that's really close to my heart. I really want to help women to have the birth that they want. So if you learn anything from it, if it's useful to you, feel free to share it around to your friends, to people who might be pregnant, to your mum's group, and just spread the word out there. Cuppa with a Doula, really trying to help women to have the birth that they want. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. Hello, and welcome back to the podcast. In today's episode, I wanted to do a little bit of a different episode because I really wanted to explore something that I find I have mentioned or has been mentioned in a few birth stories lately, but hasn't really been explored enough to my liking. So in today's episode, I really want to explore the 3 pillars of childbirth and really talk through what they mean, and also contrast those with the most recent Mother and Babies report that was published, and that takes data from 2021. So, already it's almost 3 years old, but it's the latest report we've got. So I just wanted to contrast those and give something for, if you're currently pregnant or if you're thinking of getting pregnant at some point and you're wanting to have what we call a physiological, maybe undisturbed birth. Just wanted to give you some things to think about and to consider. So, to start with, I wanted to chat about this mother and babies report. And the reason why I wanted to chat about that first before I go into the three pillars of birth is because I feel like it will really help to highlight what I'm talking about, and it will really put it into perspective about what is currently happening. So, in the 2021 Mother and Babies report, I will put the link to this report in the show notes. It is widely available. It's actually really user-friendly to read. It's actually not too wordy. It's not too scientifically worded, if that makes sense. So if you want something quite simple, they've got a lot of diagrams. It really gives you a good sense of where is the birthing system at in Australia. And I think, because you might think, well, okay, why do I, why should I care really? I think it's really important to look at that because it really gives you a sense of kind of like what you're in for, I guess. But more to the point, in this episode, I'm going to talk about advocating for yourself and really standing up for your birthing rights, really not going with what the hospital says because they say, well, that's how it is, that's how we do things, but really questioning it and really getting to why are they doing things like that? Is there an alternative? Is there another way? Is there another option for me? Really just questioning it and really getting to the bottom of it. So the Mother Babies report was published actually, I think, in 2023, and it's taken data from basically 2021. So all across Australia, across all states, it's analysed data about where did women birth, how did their labour begin, how did their labour unfold, was there any instruments used, the rates of C-section. It looks at babies' birth weight, babies' outcome when they were born, did they need resuscitation, how was their APGAR score. It looks at a lot of things, but I just want to point out, I've just picked out a few key numbers that to me are really important. So to add to this, where it becomes really interesting is this Mother Babies report data of 2021 is then compared to previous data they had from 2011 and 2004. And it's giving us a trend. It's showing us what is happening. So that's why I've picked out a few key numbers and a few comparison things as well, so that we can really talk about where is the system at today and what can you do to really help you advocate for yourself and to really get the birth you want. In 2021, across Australia, 97% of birth occurred in the hospital. So that's really showing us that most women in Australia, one way or another, end up birthing in a hospital, whether that's a public one or that's a private hospital. Home birth actually only represented 0.5%. And I think that's really highlighted even today by the fact that there is a lot of misconception around, home birth being dangerous and being something that should be illegal with big quotation marks there. And there is a lot of misconception, even from health professionals that actually don't believe in home birth. They don't believe that private midwives should be allowed to practice. And that's, there's almost this climate of fear around home birth. And so, one, it's difficult to access home birth because of the lack of privately practicing midwives that are actually available, potentially the lack of private practicing midwives in areas where women want to birth. Also the cost of it, because a large chunk of it is actually not subsidized by Medicare. And obviously private midwives have to cover the cost of their insurance, of their license, of, what it costs them to attend a birth, of their time, of their being on call time and so on. And so because of that, and also because of the fear that, some GPs, some even midwives have said to women about how dangerous they believe a home birth is and how it shouldn't be happening and so on. There is this really climate of fear around home birth. So 97% of women end up birthing in a hospital because either they're told this is the safest place, or society has led them for many, many, many years to believe that this is the safest place. And or also whether it's family, friends, your circle in general might also not be educated around home birth. And so if you want to have a home birth, but then your circle around you is keeps saying that they're worried about it and they're worried that something bad's going to happen and they really think you shouldn't do it, then it's really difficult to have a home birth when people around you are doubting basically your choices. Obviously, it is doable, but it makes it really hard. In light of, 97% of women birth in a hospital, out of those women, what I found was really interesting, and this is something I will dive into, is 34% of them had an induction of labor, and 25% of these women had no labor. So no labor meaning they had a planned C-section, essentially. And so I think those numbers are quite interesting to discuss because there is, in today's society, there is this fear around the due date. So your due date is basically the date on which you will be 40 weeks of gestation. And there is a lot of push from the hospital that as soon as you reach your due date, somehow it's a, best before, need the baby out right now. But it's not. And we know that for a lot of women, and especially a lot of first-time moms, they don't birth before 40 weeks. Some of them don't go on to birthing before 42 weeks. And they have healthy babies. Their placenta is healthy and they're fine. But there is this push from the hospital that as soon as you reach 40 weeks, there is this lingering chat or there is those scheduled appointments from the hospital that as soon as you reach your due date and you go past it, you need to have more monitoring. You need to have more scans. You need to come in for an assessment when you're just 40 weeks, I think that's interesting to consider. And that's something I will go into when I talk about the pillars of birth, about where does induction sit in that pillar of birth. The other thing that's really, really, really interesting, and I know I'm throwing a lot of data here, a lot of statistics, so sorry if you're not a statistic-oriented person. For me, I find it really cool, and I like that, you can compare between 2011 or 2004 to 2021. So sorry, the numbers will be over very soon, I promise. Between 2011 and 2021, so a 10-year period, there has been a decrease in the number of non-instrumental vaginal birth. What this essentially means is in the last 10 years, the number of vaginal birth where there's been no instruments, so no forceps, no vacuum, and therefore no episiotomies, has been decreasing. And that to me is really highlighting the fact that the hospital is trying to really intervene in birth. The hospital is really trying to get the baby out, even if the woman is actually laboring and labor seems to be unfolding, in a physiological way, which we know that when labor unfolds, it's not linear. Some labors, I don't like to use that word, but some labors stall. And what it essentially means is, maybe the contractions are less frequent or they're less intense. And from a physiological perspective, it is actually normal and very healthy for a labor to stall. And what it means is it could be that, the woman is really tired. So it could be a way for the body to give her a bit of rest so that she can gather energy. And then the labor will increase in intensity. after that. Or it could be saying, oh, and we're going to go into this very soon. It could be saying, oh, this new birth environment or the change in where I'm laboring is not working for me. I am not feeling safe. I'm not feeling right. Therefore, physiologically, my hormones, my nervous system can't function as well as they do. So the labor is stalling. So there is that too. And so the fact that the rate essentially of instruments being used in birth has been increasing in the last 10 years is really showing us that the hospital is a place where once you get there, and that's not always the case, okay? I just want to say it's not always the case, but those data are really showing us that there is a clock. Women are put on a clock. They are really watched. They are really observed. Their labor is observed. And if it seems like labor is not linearly progressing, or it's not progressing at a rate that's acceptable to the care provider, what does that mean? We don't know, because every care provider's probably got their own guideline of what a normal progressing labor is, right? And so what it means is essentially they're more likely to intervene and to use forceps or vacuum or to perform an episiotomy. And we're also seeing on the topic of instrumental birth that the use of instrument is a lot more common in first-time moms than it is on women who are having subsequent labors. So, and those numbers, sorry, I'm throwing a lot of numbers here, but they're really astonishing. So if we compare first-time moms and subsequent moms in 2021, 9.5% of first-time moms had a forceps delivery compared to 0.5% of subsequent labor mom, and 12% of first-time mom had a vacuum delivery compared to 1.8%. You can see how much more instruments are being used in first-time moms compared to subsequent pregnancies and birth. And that, to me, is highlighting that what I've been hearing through the podcast is a lot of first-time moms, they've done their research, they've done, sometimes the hospital birthing classes, if that's been available, or they've done some other form of classes, but there's sometimes they just don't know what they don't know. They don't know what they're not being told, or what they don't know what to research. And so they're more likely to agree to the use of forceps or vacuum, because usually they're being told there is a sense of emergency. The baby needs to come out now. There's no time to think. There is no time to do anything else. It needs to be a forceps or a vacuum used right now. Whereas upon reflection after that's happened, a lot of first-time moms say, well, actually, I'm sure there would have been time for me to push or try to push for another, 5 or 10 minutes. Or I'm sure if I had been, and I don't like to say allowed, but if I had been allowed to change position, or if I had been able to go onto the stool or go and squat down or go in the shower, I would have been able to birth this baby without anyone intervening. And I think this is why in those statistics, we can see that women who have subsequent labors have a lot lower rate of instruments being used, because I think they have more knowledge. They've also got more confidence. That's true, because when you've birthed once, you can say, well, I've experienced birth. I know what it is. I know my body. So no, you're not needing to use a vacuum or forceps right now. Give me time and let me do my thing, and we can talk about it later if that's necessary. So yes, a lot of it comes down to confidence, but a lot of it also comes down to research. And a lot of first-time moms and a lot of women I've had on the podcast have said they didn't do enough research the first time around because they didn't know what they were searching for. If you don't know what you're looking for, how can you research it, right? And they're not told, when you do hospital birth classes, sometimes they mention it, if they do. And if they do, they glaze over it. It's like, oh, well, we might need to use the vacuum or the forceps. But it's not really, and they're not really explained also the consequences that using instruments can have on either their babies. It can cause injuries to their babies, to the baby's head, to the baby's skull. to the baby's eyes, and it can cause injuries to their pelvic floor muscle. Internally, it can do damage. And again, on the same topic, if we compare the rate of episiotomies in 2021 and we compare it to 2004, so you've got 17 years, right, between the two. So in 17 years, in 2021, 81% of first-time moms had an episiotomy in the case of an instrument delivery. So what it essentially means is in 2021, there was 81% of moms who had an instrumental delivery, so the use of forceps or vacuum, who also required an episiotomy or also had an episiotomy performed. And that's increased in the last 17 years by 20%. So there's 20% more episiotomies performed when using an instrument. The other stat, and that one I thought was absolutely shocking, was in 2021, first-time moms, there was 23% of first-time moms that had an episiotomy when no instruments were used. So that's essentially moms that received an episiotomy when there was no use of instruments. So there was no forceps or no vacuum deliveries, yet they received an episiotomy, probably because, it looks like baby is too big, or maybe was it due to the fact that there was this fear that the baby was too big to fit, or was it that there was this sense of urgency that the baby really needed to come out right now? Because again, in 2004, this rate was only 16%. So again, it's also on the increase, and quite a significant amount, really. It really goes to show that potentially in the hospital, there might be a rush. There might be women are put on a clock, and especially when we're talking about induced labor, or the waters have released quite a time ago, that's even more true of women being put on a clock and being told your baby needs to be born before this time, today or tomorrow. And I think, one, it's really scary for women to go, oh, well, I have to birth this baby before 5 p.m. tonight. Otherwise, I will have, they will augment my labor, or, they will use forceps or vacuum, and I don't want that. And what is this fear good for? It's not good for your labor. It's not good for the cascade of hormones. The other thing I wanted to talk about is the increase rate in C-section in the last 10 years. So in 2011, there was a 32% rate of C-section across all birth. And then in 2021, it's 38. So again, we are well above the recommended rate of C-section for a developed country like Australia. And this rate is even increasing in the last 10 years. So it's really showing us that there is this rush, there is this need to intervene in birth that probably isn't always necessary, because, well, do you really need to? I mean, I'm sure there is a time and a place for everything. I'm sure some of those interventions were absolutely life-saving and required. That's true. But we are seeing numbers that are increasing. We are seeing more and more C-section, more and more instruments being used, more and more trauma being caused to women and to their babies. We are seeing that. And what for? We're trying to prevent, death or long-lasting injuries for a minority of babies. But to do that, the hospital is actually causing more harm. It's causing harm to a larger proportion of mum and babies to try and save a minimal number of babies. And I'm not dismissing that some of those are absolutely life-saving and would be saving the lives of either mum or baby. True. But we are talking about causing harm to a large proportion of the Australian population birthing in hospital to save a small number of babies. So this leads me into the 3 pillars of birth. So what are the 3 pillars of birth? So the 3 pillars of birth have been described by many, many, many people, but those ones have been described by Dr. Sarah Buckley. She is a midwife and a PhD student. She has done extensive research around childbirth, the hormonal play of childbirth, the physiology of childbirth, and so on. So she's a very knowledgeable woman. She's an author. If you haven't seen her, go and look her up. I'll put the link to her Instagram page on in the show notes. What Dr. Sarah Buckley has done extensive research on, and what's really interesting is she's found that childbirth has three main pillars, and those three main pillars are, they're essentially what helps us to have the most physiological, most efficient childbirth. So those concepts are, to have an effective childbirth, we need to feel safe, we need to feel unobserved, and we need to feel private. Now, the reason why those are is because we're mammals. So just like any other mammals, for our nervous system, so that's, everything that regulates our emotion, our ability to move, in space, our ability to perform anything, for our nervous system to be feeling calm, relaxed, and for our hormones to be producing oxytocin, to not be producing adrenaline and noradrenaline in a large quantity, which would be detrimental. It would have a negative effect on our birthing experience. So for our hormones to be releasing the right amount of hormones in the right sequence at the right time, and for us to feel, calm, relaxed, safe, we need to be feeling obviously safe, private, and unobserved. Now, when I heard that, the first thing that came to my mind was, when I was younger, I had a cat for many, many years. I had a cat. And one time this female cat I had got pregnant. And so you could see, she was really big and so on. And it came a time, where you go, oh, she's probably going to give birth, around, these weeks, because you know that a gestation of a cat is X amount of weeks. And so we were, when those weeks came, we were like, oh, she might give birth anytime soon. I wonder where she's going to do it. And it happened on, I think, two consecutive years. The same thing happened. So each time that my cat was about to give birth, she would disappear. Like, we just wouldn't find her for like days. And we'd be like, oh, okay, she's like, I don't know where she is, right? And so it was a bit strange. Like, she would disappear for either hour or like overnight. We just wouldn't find her the next day. And so we're like, oh, okay, that's strange. And both times it turns out that my cat was giving birth, and she obviously knew that she was about to give birth. And so she went into, back then, I thought were the most random places of all, but she actually went both times to a place that was quite small, that was contained, a little bit dark, actually, a little bit on the darker side. And we're in a room that was absolutely quiet. There was no one in those rooms, actually. And if we think back about the pillars of birth, she actually went into a room to feel private. She went into a place where she felt safe, and she was definitely in a room where she was unobserved. And then when I thought of it, I'm like, oh, like, and this is a cat we're talking about, right? So mammals know that the best place to give birth is a place where they feel like they're not observed, they're on their own, potentially in the dark, they feel safe, and they feel private. And so why are we not doing it? We are very intelligent. We have a lot of intelligence, and yet we give birth potentially not in a place that feels private, safe, or unobserved for us. So why are we doing this, right? So now, if we put it in the context of, our birth, right? So if we think back, and this is true, Sarah Buckley describes that if you're trying to think of the place that feels, the most safe, private, and unobserved, it is probably the same vibe that led you to the conception of your child. Makes sense, right? Because to be able to conceive your child, you probably felt safe, private, and unobserved. That makes sense. So now, if we put it in the context of childbirth, so this is quite a common experience. This is one I experienced myself. So when I was in labor with my first, I labored at home, and I had been told by my midwife to stay at home for as long as possible. Just come in when you really feel like you can't do it anymore, and then, we'll assess you and so on. So I thought, okay, cool. So I started laboring in the middle of the night. So I labored at home, and, at the time I didn't know, but my labor was actually progressing quite well. It wasn't particularly like it was unfolding quite nicely. Things were happening as they should. My contractions were definitely getting more intense as time went on. And so at some point I really felt like because in my mind I was birthing, my place of birth was the hospital. It wasn't home. So in my mind, I really felt like there was a time where I just knew that if I didn't leave now, my baby would be born at home. So therefore I left. So got in the car, and then I got to hospital. And as soon as I got into the hospital, my labor stalled. And so now I had been told, it's normal for labor to stall and so on. But see, now that I think back at it, well, yeah, of course it's normal for labor to stall when you get to hospital, because you're getting into a place that you don't know. Even if you've been to hospital every single week for your appointments, or every time for your appointments, even if your midwife, I had continuity of care. I knew my midwife, but even then it's a place where it's not your space. Even if you bring, you can bring lamps, you can bring, LED candles, you can bring diffuser, your music, your affirmations, your, what really helps you to make the space yours. But see, I was in a state of labor where I was about to hit transition at that point. So I wasn't about to set up, to put my little cards up and to put my music up and to put my diffuser on. At this point, I wasn't in a state to do it. And, well, you'd think, oh, well, your birth partner can do it. Well, yes, but at this point, I needed him right next to me, not setting up, the candles on the cupboard and putting the little LED lights on and so on, So there was no familiarity in this birth space. I had seen it once, and I definitely felt observed. That's true. Like, I definitely felt like that, even though I knew my midwife and I had prepared myself for the fact that she would be there in the birth and she would be helping me. And, it just, she's essentially a stranger at your most vulnerable point that, you've invited in your space. So to me, I definitely felt observed, and therefore I didn't feel private, So now what I'm saying is that you can have a physiological, with the least intervention possible, birth in a hospital. You can have a birth where you feel potentially safe and observed and private. To help you to achieve that, if this is what you want, I'm going to give you what I feel is essential to be able to create a space that is going to be conducive of producing, the right hormones for your labor, and also for you to feel like you're in your own bubble and you can give birth safely in a hospital. So to me, the first step is to pick a hospital where ideally you've got continuity of care. So either that means you're part of a midwifery group practice, or you're part of a team-led midwifery care program where you have either one known midwife to do all your appointments and who will be at your birth ideally, or you have a small number of midwives that you have met each of them. This is not always achievable because only 8% of women in Australia have access to this midwifery-led continuity of care. So if you don't have access to a midwifery group practice, you haven't been accepted into one, or, you applied too late or something, the other two ways you can get continuity of care in your birth is to hire a student midwife. I will put in the show notes the links to the two Facebook groups where you can post or you can search for a student midwife. I'll also put the link to Cuppa with a Pro number 2, I believe, with the student midwife Kirsten, where we actually talk about what is a student midwife, why they are absolutely amazing in providing you continuity of care, and how to go about finding a student midwife. So this method is free. There is no cost associated with hiring a student midwife. You're actually helping them to complete requirements of their studies. The other way is to hire a doula, and that is an option that comes at a cost. You can maybe find a student doula, which usually is a much reduced cost, and that can be maybe an option as well if available, to you, or if financially viable. So those to me are the two ways you can get continuity of care and have at least someone in there in your birth space that really knows you and that you feel comfortable around. The other thing to consider is, who are you letting in your birth space? So, think about the people that will be there at your birth. You essentially need to be comfortable for example, they need to be people that you would be comfortable pooping in front of, essentially, because labor is a very intimate process. It's something where it's highly likely you will be naked or there will be clothing removed. You may or may not poop, actually. And, people will essentially see you in a vulnerable state, but also in a state of, having a lot less clothing on and so on, right? And having certain parts exposed. So you definitely need to be comfortable with the idea that there will be strangers seeing you in your vulnerable state, and also in a state that you're usually not in, where you may be making primal sounds, childbearing noises that are totally normal, but that you may not feel comfortable doing in front of people you're not, you don't really know, right? So a lot of consideration to go into who will be at your birth, who will be in your birth space as well. The next thing that's extremely important to have a really oxytocin rich environment, and an environment that makes you feel safe, private, and observed, so that you have a lot of oxytocin, so that you have a lot of contractions, and so therefore your contractions are really working on the cervix, and it's really effective at, essentially pushing baby out, right? So it's probably highly likely that a darker environment, so an environment where either you can shut curtains and it's entirely black, even if it's in the middle of the day, or maybe consider wearing an eye mask, so that if, for example, you're driving to the hospital, you essentially can't black out the car, obviously, but if you wear an eye mask, then that way, when you go to hospital on your drive, you're not disrupted by, the traffic lights and the lights from outside and the lights from the cars and, so on, right? The other thing that's important is the noises in your environment. So to help you to really go within, to really focus on this labor, to really feel the surges and let them wash over you and not fight them, and be really, really accepting and surrendering of labor, you probably need maybe some music or maybe some soundtracks, like either meditation soundtracks or maybe hypnobirthing soundtracks, or, some form of maybe guided relaxation soundtracks, or maybe it's your music. And the point with that is that it helps you to stay within your bubble. So you're not hearing what's happening around you. You're not being disrupted by people asking questions, or by, sound from cars beeping, or, like outside noises when you're driving to the hospital. It's a lot less disruption. So that way, if you've got your soundtracks on, your music, whatever it is, then one, it probably redirects questions away from you, so you're not having to answer questions when you're in labor. And also, it keeps you in your bubble, so you're not being disrupted. You can continue to focus on all the techniques you've learned about relaxation, surrendering, about, taking it one surge at a time and really focusing on those. Good lead up into the next point. When you're in labor, the last thing you want is to be thinking and using the frontal cortex to answer questions, to think about what you want, to think about your options, to think about anything. So you want to be in your primal mode. You want to be in mammal mode. You want to be in my cat's state of giving birth, essentially, where where basically all that your body is doing, not all obviously because it's a lot of work, but you are focusing solely on your surges, on your contractions. You are surrendering, you are accepting of it, and you are not thinking about anything else. So consider your birth partner being the person who answers questions like, what gestation is she? Or, have you got a birth plan? Or, those questions you get on admission at the hospital, and also the questions you get in the birth room, like, oh, we're seeing this, we might need to do XXX, those are things your birth partner, so whether that's your partner in life, your husband, your wife, your doula, your student midwife, they can answer those because you will have briefed them, you will have had extensive conversation with them about your birth preferences. I have done an episode with Catherine Bell from the Birth Map, and this episode is epic. But the reason why I'm mentioning it now is because the idea of birth mapping is really important in this situation. So the idea of birth mapping is, instead of just writing your birth preferences and saying, I want candles, I want low lights, I want music in the delivery room, you're actually exploring what you would do in different scenarios. So you are really exploring, what if we need to use forceps of vacuum? What do I want? What if we need to perform an episiotomy? What do I want? When do I want it? What if we need to perform a C-section? How do I want my C-section to go? Who do I want in the theater? What if baby needs to be taken to the NICU? Where do I want my husband at this point? What if I am losing a lot of blood? What do I want at this point? So you are exploring, essentially, I don't want to say anything that can go wrong, but you are exploring options so that on the day, if anything happens, your birth partner actually knows what your preferences are. Think about a case scenario where you are unable to express yourself, whether it's because you're just totally out of it, you've lost a lot of blood, you're feeling completely drowsy, dizzy, you're just not in a state to answer, or potentially you've lost consciousness maybe, or something. Obviously I'm talking very dramatic at this point, but imagine a state of childbirth where you are not able to vocalize and to even think about what you want. So preparing yourself for those scenarios, saying to your birth partner what you would like at this point, is really essential, because it will help them to really navigate that time with a lot less stress, because they will know what you want and they will have discussed with you this possibility. So that's the other thing to prepare. Now, if we're thinking back about feeling safe, private, and observed in a hospital room, a lot of women have found that laboring in the bathroom has been a really good place for them. Now, if we think back about those pillars of birth, it makes sense. Usually in the bathroom, there is no windows, so you can completely make it dark by shutting the light and closing the door. It's also a smaller space than the actual birth suite itself. And sometimes by closing the door, you're actually closing the door to the care provider. So again, you're becoming private and unobserved at this point. It can be a really good place for you to labor. And usually when you're in the bathroom, you can't be on your back. So therefore, you're, instead of being on your back, like potentially the care provider's been saying, you're actually mobilizing, you're moving, you're squatting down, you're sitting on the toilet, you're putting hot water on your back if you're feeling like you've got back labor. It's actually, all those things will actually be more conducive to your labor than laying on the bed and just waiting for the next contraction to push. Another thing to discuss with your birth partner is telling them signs that potentially your labor is stalling, or telling them that if they hear, oh, your wife's labor is stalling, then instructing them to tell you and to guide you to potentially the bathroom so that you and him can have this private, unobserved moment and potentially restart, so to speak, your labor actually. Same thing when you get to the birth suite, making this environment yours. So bringing in, LED candles, your music, your speakers, your diffuser, your birth ball, your blanket, your pillow, your whatever makes you feel more at home, more comfortable. Because again, you need to feel safe. So you need to feel safe is obviously, the definition of safe is dependent on, everyone. It's very personal. But the more stuff you bring from home, probably the safer you will feel, because it will feel a lot less clinical and a lot less, antiseptic, type environment, right? And the other thing I want to talk about in terms of being unobserved, right? So we talked about basically going into the bathroom and potentially shutting the door and there, being there with maybe just yourself or maybe yourself and your partner or your doula. And the other thing in terms of being unobserved is, if you can, try to not have any form of, if you can, having no continuous monitoring. So basically, having no CTG on also helps to not feel observed, because if you've got the CTG on, well, that, those constant, those numbers, those contractions are being watched, they're being monitored and so on. And also, when you have CTG on, sometimes, the signal drops because, well, as baby gets lower and lower and lower in the uterus and then into the vaginal canal and so on, obviously the CTG has to be moved down as well to continue to get the signal from, the heart rate signal of baby. So obviously there will be some disruption there where, someone is trying to place the CTG this way and that way. And obviously that's highly disruptive of your labor. So if you can, try and decline the CTG if that's an option. They can do a Doppler check, every so often, whatever. And that way, at least you're mobile, you're free to move anywhere, and you're feeling a lot less, observed, and you've got potentially a lot less disruptions from someone either trying to get the signal back or telling you, oh, wait, you need to stay on the bed because we get a better signal there, or, something like that. When it comes to an induction, so the reason why an induction of labor might actually very much disturb these pillars of birth is because when you're induced, so potentially you haven't even began labor, or your labor has been maybe a bit erratic, it hasn't really got a pattern that you can, closely follow. So when you're induced or augmented, they basically, you're either given syntocin in an IV drip, or if labor hasn't even began, they might be using the gel on your cervix or inserting the balloon to try and begin this dilation process. And so all these methods will they will create artificial surges. So those contractions are not ones that would occur naturally, and they're not, even though it is oxytocin, it is a lab made version of oxytocin. So it's not the same as the one that we produce when we feel safe, private, and observed, and we're having a spontaneous labor. So those contractions can be quite a lot more intense. They can be quite a lot more relentless. There might be no space between them. And it's a lot harder to feel private, safe, and unobserved when you're hooked up to, the IV. So you've got an IV drip, and potentially you've got the IV of syntocin as well. You've probably got the CTG on at this point if you're being induced, and you put on a clock basically. So you do have a midwife or an obstetrician that is checking on you every X hours, and therefore coming in, interrupting the flow of labor and telling you what they're seeing. So if this is you, if you need to have an induction, well, so be it. And remember, the tips I've given you about trying to bargain. So saying, well, can I have a Bluetooth CTG? If you really need to use it, can I be mobile? I want to be moving as much as possible. I want to be able to, go into the shower if I feel the need to. I want to be able to squat down and sit on the toilet to help me to dilate. And also creating this space. So obviously, if you're being induced, chances are you're beginning your labor in hospital. So you're not even beginning your labor at home. So trying to create the most homely feeling you can in a hospital room. So again, try and maybe make it darker and ask for the midwives to not come in and turn on the lights, and ask for questions to be redirected to your birth partner, creating a birth plan of saying, well, this is what I want, this is what I don't want. I do not want you to come and interrupt me. I do not want vaginal examinations, for example. I want to be left to labor on my own. Yes, I will have the CTG on, but leave me to move and moan and do everything that I want, be on all fours, whatever it is, on my own, So things to consider, things to explore if this is going to be the way that your labor begins, because you can have a positive induction, but it takes a lot of preparation. It takes a lot of research. And also, don't be afraid to stand up for yourself. Even if the hospital says, okay, well, now we're going to induce you and we're going to give you the epidural. If you don't want the epidural, you can say, no, I don't want the epidural. And if you've done your research, you can say, well, I can have the epidural at a later point if I want to. And don't let them talk you into, oh, well, the anesthesiologist is like right around the corner now. And so, it would be more practical if they did the epidural now. Just go with your intuition. Remember, the brain acronym. Whenever you told something, whenever you asked something, so ask for consent and so on, use the brain acronym. What are the benefits of this? What are the risks of this? What are the alternatives? What other option do I have? What is my intuition telling me? How does this resonate with potentially the type of birth that I want to have? What happens if I do nothing or if I don't do it now? And asking those questions will really help you to find out what options do you have, what is available, but also to really show that you've done your research and that this is what you want to do. You're informed and you're not giving consent just because they're saying we're going to do this. Are you happy with it? You have actually researched. You know what you want, you know what you don't want. This is how it is. You're telling them. You are telling the hospital staff how you want your birth to go. And that's amazing. Do you? So on this, I will leave you to it. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much to the growing numbers of listeners I have had. I am so thrilled that it is helping people. My messages, my direct messages on Instagram and Facebook are always open. Feel free to, send me a message. Tell me what you like. Tell me what you don't like about the podcast. Tell me about your birth. Tell me, whatever. Have a chat. I'm always happy to chat. I always answer everyone who messages me. So yeah, thank you so much for listening. I really hope that this episode has been helpful, that you've learned something, that it has, you've taken one thing out of it, if anything. And again, feel free to share it. I really want this to help as many moms as possible to have the most positive birthing experience possible, especially in the light of what is happening with birth trauma, with the New South Wales birth inquiry. We know that there is a lot of trauma that results from childbirth and from, even pregnancy. So I really want this to help people to have the most empowered birth that they can, and to be feeling like they're in charge of their birth and that they're birthing on their own terms, really. So thank you so much for tuning into today's conversation, and I will see you next week for a brand new episode. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to get notified of when a new episode comes out, please subscribe to this show on your podcast listening platform. Also, I would really appreciate it if you could leave me a review on Apple Podcast or share this episode so that other moms can find it. If you would like to tell your own pregnancy, birth, or parenting story, please head to the show notes and you will find a form there to get in touch with me. Again, thank you so much for listening, and I will be with you again next week for a new episode.